A story of ice, fire, and the power that should not exist. They left her in the Ashenmoor with nothing but her Omega service tunic and the temperature dropping toward the killing cold. 12 Council Wolves. The Ironhold Pack's senior leadership. They walked her out to the Ashenmoor Flats at dusk, and the Alpha gave the formal exile declaration in the cold air, and then they turned and walked back toward the warm lights of the packhouse, and they did not look back. She had 23 years of pack life behind her and 3 charges of defiance on her record and 1 catastrophically bad evening where she had walked into the pack council chamber and told 7 senior wolves that what they were doing to the Eastern Quarter families was wrong and had used specific language to describe it that the council would spend the next month referring to as unacceptable Omega conduct. None of them expected to see her again. The Ashenmoor in winter was not survivable. Not for an unshifted Omega with no supplies and no shelter and temperatures that dropped below the threshold of standard wolf cold tolerance by midnight of the first night. It was not supposed to be survivable. The exile to the Ashenmoor was the kind of exile that was only technically an exile rather than an execution, because the word exile was in the official record and the word execution was not. She survived the first night. She survived it by doing something that no one in the Ironhold Pack knew she was capable of, because the capability was the specific thing she had been hiding since the age of 16 when she first understood what it was and what it would do to her if anyone found out. She shifted. Not the standard Omega shift that her assessment at 12 had suggested she would eventually produce, mild and manageable and confirmation of a low-rank classification. What came forward in the Ashenmoor Flats on the first night of her exile was something that the frozen ground registered as a seismic event at a radius of 400 meters. She survived the second night. She survived it by hunting. She survived the third night by making a decision. The decision was this. For 7 years she had been hiding what she was because she understood what the Ironhold Pack would do to something they could not categorize and could not control. For 7 years she had carried the forbidden power quietly inside a classification file that said Omega and had performed the role of someone who did not know she was something else entirely. They had exiled her anyway. They had exiled her for using words. For speaking truth in a room where truth was not welcome. They had taken the 7 years of her careful management and the performance of smallness and the absorbed indignities and the strategic invisibility, and they had exiled her for the one thing she had never suppressed, which was the specific conviction that wrong was wrong. If they were going to exile her for what she believed, she was done hiding what she was. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked out of the Ashenmoor Flats. Not back toward the Ironhold Pack. North. Toward whatever came next. And the Ashenmoor Flats, which had not seen anything like what had just spent 3 nights in them, were perfectly still behind her as she left. Subscribe, comment, like and share. Subscribe and leave a comment telling us what you think happened to Veyra in those 3 nights in the Ashenmoor. Share this with everyone who loves a wolf heroine who was abandoned and came back as something her pack had no name for. Like the video. Chapter 1. The 3 nights that changed everything. The Ashenmoor Flats were called the Ashenmoor for a reason that had nothing to do with the season. The soil was the gray-white of old ash even in summer, a pale mineral expanse that stretched for 40 kilometers in every direction from the center point and that supported almost nothing. No trees. No significant undergrowth. The occasional hardy scrub plant that had worked out how to extract enough from the drained soil to maintain itself without thriving. The Ashenmoor was the kind of landscape that communicated its hostility through its absolute absence of welcome rather than through anything actively threatening. In winter, it was a different category of hostility entirely. The temperature on the Ashenmoor Flats dropped faster than anywhere else in the Ironhold Pack territory because there was nothing to hold warmth. No canopy. No windbreak. No natural shelter of any kind. The cold came off the eastern mountain range in the late afternoon, and by midnight it had reached the temperatures that the pack's medical reference described as unsurvivable for standard wolves without shelter for longer than 6 to 8 hours. Veyra Ashk had been standing in it for approximately 40 minutes when she allowed herself to begin calculating. She was 23 years old, and she had been hiding the specific thing she was since age 16, and she had been a member of the Ironhold Pack since she was born, and she was wearing a thin gray Omega service tunic in below-freezing temperatures with the wind coming off the eastern range in a straight line with nothing to interrupt it, and the 12 council wolves who had walked her out here were now approximately 4 kilometers south of her position and still moving. She calculated for 6 minutes. She had been doing this kind of calculation her whole life, the calculation of when a situation crossed the threshold from manageable to unsurvivable, the calculation that required an honest accounting of resources and requirements and what was actually available to address the gap between them. The calculation resolved clearly. The gap between what she needed to survive and what the Ashenmoor Flats would provide her in human form was not closable by any amount of determination or preparation or cold resistance. The temperature was going to cross the unsurvivable threshold in approximately 4 hours. She had no shelter, no food, no additional clothing, and no fire-starting materials. She had one thing. She had the power she had been hiding for 7 years. She had been hiding it because she had read everything available in the Ironhold Pack's library about what the pack leadership did when they identified a wolf whose capabilities did not fit the standard classification framework. The historical record was consistent and unambiguous. Wolves who expressed capabilities outside the expected range were either controlled or eliminated. The choice between those two outcomes depended on how useful the capability was to the pack's leadership and how compliant the wolf expressing it was willing to be. She was not interested in being controlled by the people who had just exiled her into the Ashenmoor for the crime of accurate speech. She had also read enough of the old bloodline texts in the restricted section of the library, accessed over 3 careful years of patient systematic work, to understand what she was carrying. Not the pack classification system's version of it. The actual ancient name for it, in the language the texts used before the current classification system was established. Frostcaller. 1 bloodline in every 7 generations. A wolf whose relationship with temperature was the inverse of the standard. Standard wolves were warm-blooded creatures who maintained their core temperature through metabolic heat and whose wolf form amplified that warmth. A Frostcaller was a wolf whose power ran cold, not from weakness, but from the specific ancient capacity to channel the deep cold rather than resist it, to use it as fuel rather than fighting it as threat. In the wolf form, a Frostcaller did not produce warmth. She produced something that functioned in the same way warmth functioned for standard wolves, but was made of cold, drawn from the environment and converted into the specific kind of energy that kept the wolf functional and powerful regardless of temperature. The colder the environment, the more power she had. The Ashenmoor in winter, at the temperatures that the pack's medical reference described as unsurvivable, was not a death sentence for Veyra Ashk. It was a power source. She let the shift come. She had shifted before. In private. In the deep forest outside the pack boundary at night, where the sound and the visual and the atmospheric effect of what she produced when she shifted would not be observed by any wolf in any position to report it. She had shifted carefully, with the managed restraint of someone who understood that what came forward in her wolf form was not something the world around her was ready for, and she had worked with what came forward for exactly as long as it was safe to do so before putting it back. In the Ashenmoor Flats at dusk, with the temperature dropping and the 12 council wolves 4 kilometers south and receding, she did not shift with managed restraint. She shifted completely. The wolf that stood on the Ashenmoor Flats where Veyra Ashk had been standing was the color of deep winter ice. A pale blue-white that was not the absence of color, but a specific color that existed only in ice that was old enough to have compressed into something dense and clear. Her eyes were the pale blue of open sky at the highest altitude, a color so light it bordered on colorless, and they caught the last of the dusk light and returned it as something colder and more precise. She was large. Not the standard large of a capable alpha. The large of something that existed in a different tier of the hierarchy, a scale that required the surrounding landscape to recalibrate rather than simply register. The temperature around her dropped by 3 degrees in the immediate radius. She felt it as warmth. She ran. The first night, she explored the Ashenmoor in the wolf form, learning the terrain with the specific thorough intelligence of someone who had always used every available moment to understand the environment she was in. The Ashenmoor was not empty. It had its own ecosystem, adapted to the mineral-poor cold soil and the extreme winter temperatures, and it had its own inhabitants, the creatures that had evolved specifically for exactly this kind of place. The predators of the Ashenmoor gave her a very wide berth. She understood why. She shifted back at dawn and sat in the center of the flats and breathed the cold air and felt the power still running through her from the night and thought about what she was going to do next. The second night she hunted. The Ashenmoor had prey if you knew how to find it. She knew how to find it because she had spent 3 years reading everything available about the Ashenmoor ecology in the Pack Library and the Regional Archive. Not because she had planned to be exiled there, but because she was the kind of person who read everything available about everything she might someday need to know. She ate well on the second night. The third night, she made her decision. She sat in the wolf form in the center of the Ashenmoor Flats at midnight with the temperature at the lowest it had been across the 3 nights and the power from the cold running through her at full depth, and she thought about the 7 years of hiding and the 3 charges of defiance and the 1 evening in the council chamber and the 12 wolves walking away without looking back. She thought about the Eastern Quarter families, the wolves who had been quietly losing territory and resources to the council's administrative reorganization over 3 years, and who had been told repeatedly by the council that their concerns were registered and would be addressed, which was the specific language of a governance body that had decided not to address something and was buying time. She thought about how the Ironhold Pack was run by people who had confused the performance of authority with its legitimate exercise. She thought about what she was carrying and what it was capable of and what the old texts said about the last Frostcaller, who had been documented as choosing exile over compliance and had then spent 20 years operating outside the pack structure and had come back in her 40th year and had not been turned away. She thought, I am 23. I have time. She thought, but the Eastern Quarter families do not have 20 years. She thought, I need a plan that is faster than exile and return. By the time the third night ended, she had the beginning of one. She shifted back to human form at dawn, and she stood in the Ashenmoor Flats, and the cold was just cold again. Manageable and no longer threatening because 3 nights of the wolf form had acclimated her to temperatures that should have killed her in the first 6 hours. She looked north. The northern Ashenmoor boundary was where the Greyveil territories began, and Greyveil was the largest pack in the northern range. And the Greyveil Alpha was a wolf named Kaelin Dusk who had a reputation for governance that the Ironhold Council spoke about with the specific dismissive tone people use when they are privately threatened by a comparison. She started walking. Chapter 2. The Alpha Who Read Old Maps. Kaelin Dusk had been the alpha of the Greyveil Pack for 9 years and had spent those 9 years running what his predecessor had described in the formal succession documentation as the most complicated pack in the northern range with the most geographically dispersed territory and the most diverse population of any pack that did not have the resources of a large central governance apparatus. His predecessor had meant it as a warning. Kaelin had read it as a description of an interesting problem and had spent 9 years working on it. He was in the northern watch station of the Greyveil boundary zone when the lookout wolf reported an approach from the south. The northern watch station was a stone building at the highest point of the boundary ridge, built specifically to have sight lines across the Ashenmoor Flats to the southern horizon. And Kaelin was in it because he had been in it every morning for the last 3 days while the intelligence report about a significant atmospheric event in the central Ashenmoor was being verified. The atmospheric event report had been filed by 2 separate lookout stations and described as temperature anomaly, central Ashenmoor, non-standard wolf presence indication. He had read both reports twice and had come to the watch station himself because the description in the reports used language that matched something he had read in the restricted bloodline archive 3 years ago during a systematic study of pre-governance framework, wolf history. He had read those reports and gone straight to the watch station and had been there since. The approaching figure crossed the boundary ridge at midday. She was in human form. He could see from the watch station that she was wearing standard Omega service clothing that was completely wrong for the temperature and the terrain, and yet she was moving across the final stretch of Ashenmoor with the steady, controlled pace of someone who is not in physical distress, which was not consistent with anyone who had spent 3 nights in those conditions in that clothing, unless they had a very specific and very unusual relationship with the cold. He went down to the boundary ridge to meet her. Not with a formation. Not with guards. He had learned early in his 9 years of alpha leadership that the way you approached something communicated your assessment of it, and approaching alone communicated that he had made an assessment, and the assessment was not threat. He was not certain what the assessment was yet. But threat was not it. She stopped when she saw him coming down the ridge. She waited. He reached the boundary marker and stood there and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the first thing he registered was the quality of her eyes, which were not the standard dark eyes or light eyes of the classification range he was used to reading. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, a shade that he had read described in one document and one document only in 9 years of reading everything he could find about old bloodline anomalies. He said, "You were in the Ashenmoor for 3 nights." She said, "Yes." He said, "In standard Omega service clothing." She said, "Yes." He said, "What did the temperature drop to on the 2nd night?" She said, "Approximately 26 degrees below the standard wolf cold tolerance threshold." He said, "And you survived it?" She said, "I did more than survive it." He said, "I know." She looked at him with those pale, almost colorless eyes. She said, "You know what I am." He said, "I believe I have a theory. I would like to verify it." She said, "Ask." He said, "The atmospheric event at the central Ashenmoor on the 1st night. My lookout stations recorded a temperature drop of 3 degrees in a radius of approximately 400 meters around a moving point source. That pattern is documented in the restricted bloodline archive in 2 separate primary texts from the pre-governance era." He said, "Both texts use the same word for the bloodline that produces it." She said, "Frostcaller." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes." She said, "You read the restricted archive?" He said, "I have read everything in the restricted archive and 3 external sources that should be in it, but are catalogued incorrectly. I have been running a program of historical bloodline research for 5 years because my territory has 3 documented bloodline anomaly families, and I needed to understand what they were carrying before someone else found out first." She said, "What did you find?" He said, "That the current classification framework was established 300 years ago specifically to suppress the expression of 7 bloodline capabilities that the governance coalition of that era found threatening. That the suppression was not total because some of those capabilities went underground before the framework was fully implemented. And that the Frostcaller bloodline was one of the 7. She said, "The Ironhold Pack exiled me for speaking accurately about their administrative conduct." He said, "I know about the Ironhold Council's management of the Eastern Quarter situation. It has been a concern of the regional governance network for 2 years." She said, "And the exile?" He said, "Also a concern. Exile to the Ashenmoor in winter is not exile. It is an execution with administrative language over it." She said, "They did not know I would survive." He said, "No. They could not have known." He said, "Are you hungry?" She said, "I ate last night. I would like shelter and warmth for other people in the vicinity rather than myself. The cold is not uncomfortable for me currently." He said, "I noticed you were not shivering." She said, "I have not been cold since the 1st shift." He said, "How long have you been hiding the Frostcaller capability?" She said, 7 years. Since I was 16 and found the first primary text and understood what would happen if the Ironhold Pack knew." He said, "And no one in 7 years discovered it." She said, "I was careful." He said, "Come inside. We have a great deal to discuss and standing at the boundary marker in the wind is not the optimal environment for it." She said, "Kaelin Dusk. Before we go inside, I want to be clear about something." He waited. She said, "I did not come north because I need a pack to take me in. I did not come north because I am looking for protection or a rescuer or a new community that will accept me. I came north because your governance record is the best in the northern range, and because the problem I am trying to solve requires resources I do not currently have, and because I assessed you as the most likely alpha to be willing to work on a problem rather than simply manage it. She said, I am proposing a collaboration, not a rescue. If the terms are not acceptable, I will continue north and find another approach. He looked at her for a long moment. He had been an alpha for 9 years, and in those 9 years, he had had exactly 3 conversations that had this specific quality. The quality of someone presenting him with a real problem and a real proposal for addressing it, and a completely honest account of what they were offering and what they needed in return. He said, the terms. She said, I want the Eastern Quarter family's territorial situation addressed. I want the Ironhold Pack's exile documentation reviewed by the Regional Governance Network. I want formal acknowledgement that the Frostcaller capability is not a threat to be managed, but a bloodline to be understood. And I want 6 months of access to your restricted archive and your historical research before I decide whether the collaboration has produced anything that justifies extending it. He said. And what you are offering? She said, I am offering the most accurate read of the Ashenmoor terrain and its defensive implications that anyone in the northern range has because I just spent 3 nights learning it from the inside. I am offering 7 years of strategic patience in hostile conditions, which is a capability that is harder to develop than it sounds. And I am offering the specific thing I am, which the old texts suggest has governance implications that your research probably identified when you read the archive. He said, the Frostcaller's secondary capability. She said, yes. He said, the territory stabilization function. The Frostcaller in the old framework was not simply a powerful wolf. It was the specific wolf whose presence in a territory could stabilize the territory's environmental conditions and extend the productive capacity of the land. She said, and the Greyveil territory has 3 sectors that have been showing erosion patterns consistent with pack territory destabilization for the last 4 years. He went very still. He said, you read our territory reports. She said, I read everything available about the northern range packs before I started walking north. Your territory reports are in the Regional Governance Network's public file. The erosion pattern in sectors 7, 11, and 14 is consistent with the pre-governance text description of destabilization in territories that are missing a specific element. He said, the element being a Frostcaller presence. She said, yes. He said, the terms are acceptable. He said, come inside. She came inside. The Greyveil Northern Watch Station was warm and well-built and had the specific quality of a space that was used constantly and maintained because it mattered rather than because it was supposed to be maintained. She sat at the table and drank the tea that the lookout wolf produced and looked around the space with the same cataloging attention she brought to everything. Kalen sat across from her and put his own tea down and looked at her with those dark green eyes that she had already classified as the eyes of someone who read primary sources. He said, your name. She said, Veyra Ashk. He said, Veyra. How much do you know about what the Frostcaller can do at full expression? She said, everything the 3 primary texts describe and everything I have observed in my own experience across 7 years of private practice. He said, and the full expression. She said, I have not reached it. The Ashenmoor was the closest I have come. He said, what did it feel like? She said, like standing at the edge of something very large. Like being aware of a capacity that I have not yet learned the full dimensions of. He said, that is what the primary texts describe as the pre-awakening state. They say the Frostcaller's power reaches full expression only in response to a direct existential threat to the territory the Frostcaller has bonded to. She said, which means the sectors in your territory. He said, we would need to do this carefully. The bonding process is described in the texts as requiring time and attention. She said, how much time? He said, the texts are inconsistent on the duration. Weeks to months. It depends on the territory's condition and the Frostcaller's specific bloodline expression. She said, the Eastern Quarter families. He said, I will have the formal review request filed with the Regional Governance Network before this evening is over. She said, You are moving fast. He said, You have been carrying this for 7 years. I have been reading about it for 5. We are both overdue. She looked at him. She said, You have more questions. He said, I have considerably more questions. We have 6 months to get through them. She said, Then ask the most important one first. He said, The second night in the Ashenmoor. You said you did more than survive it. What does that mean? She said, There is a point in the cold, when the temperature reaches a specific depth, where the Frostcaller does not simply maintain. Where the power accumulates rather than merely sustaining itself. Where the cold stops being what you are drawing from, and becomes what you are made of in that moment. She said, On the second night I understood what the old text meant when it said the Frostcaller does not resist the cold. She becomes it. He was very still for a long moment. He said, And when that happens? She said, The territory around me knew I was there. Not metaphorically. The Ashenmoor responded. I felt it the way you feel a response from something that has been waiting for something specific for a very long time. He said, The Ashenmoor has been showing the same destabilization markers as our sectors 7, 11, and 14. She said, I know. I read that report too. He looked at her with those dark green eyes. He said, Veyra Ashk. She said, Yes. He said, I am very glad you walked north. Chapter 3. What the territory remembered. The bonding process was not what either of them had expected. The old texts described it in the language of ancient practice, specific ritual and intention, and the deliberate orientation of the Frostcaller's awareness toward the territory she was bonding with. Veyra had read those descriptions 3 times over the first week of her presence in the Greyveil territory and had concluded that the ritual framing was the era's way of describing what was actually a biological process. The specific attunement of a particular bloodline to a particular land, which was not mystical but was also not reducible to anything in the current classification framework's vocabulary. She described this conclusion to Kaelin on the 8th day while they were walking the boundary of Sector 11, the most severely destabilized of the 3 affected sectors. He said, The ritual framing in the old texts always made me suspicious too. The era that wrote them did not have the vocabulary for what they were observing. They used the language they had. She said, which means the actual mechanism is different from the procedure they described. He said, I believe the actual mechanism is contact. Extended sustained contact between the Frostcaller and the affected territory over time. Not ceremony. Time. She said, and intention. You cannot accidentally bond to a territory. He said, You have to choose it. She looked at the Sector 11 terrain. It was one of the southernmost sectors of the Greyveil territory, a stretch of mixed woodland and open high meadow that had been showing the gradual erosion markers for 4 years. The erosion was not dramatic. It was the specific kind of slow degradation that territories showed when the biological systems in the soil were losing coherence, when the fungal networks and the root systems and the water table interactions that made a territory productive were slowly disordering. She knelt and put her hand on the ground. The Sector 11 soil was cold and dense and carried in it the specific quality of something that was trying to hold itself together with insufficient resources. Her wolf responded. Not the full shift. The partial engagement of the Frostcaller capability that she had learned to use in private during the 7 years of hiding, the controlled deployment of the cold power into the specific application she chose. She directed it downward, into the ground, the way you direct water into a channel rather than releasing it to spread where it will. The ground under her hand changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly to someone who was not paying very close attention. The temperature in the immediate area dropped by 0.5 degree and the specific frequency that she felt through her palm from the soil shifted from the slightly disordered quality of destabilization to something more coherent, as if a single thread had been straightened in a tangled cloth. One thread. She stood. She said, It is going to take time. He was watching her with the expression she had already learned to recognize as his primary processing mode, the expression of someone who was integrating what he was observing with what he already knew and was arriving at implications. He said, "Do you need to be in physical contact with the ground for it to work?" She said, "At this stage, yes." The old text suggests the contact requirement decreases as the bond develops. At full bond, the Frostcaller can affect the territory from anywhere within it. "But we are weeks from that," he said, "and the process. Is it draining for you?" She said, "No. I am drawing from the cold, not from my own reserves. The process sustains itself if there is sufficient cold available." He said, "There is always sufficient cold in the northern range." She said, "Yes. Which is why the Frostcaller bloodline appears in northern bloodlines rather than southern ones." He said, "Environment shapes expression." She said, "Always." They walked the Sector 11 boundary for 2 more hours. She stopped at 7 additional points and performed the same careful directed contact with the soil. At each point, she felt the same small coherence response, the territory recognizing what she was offering and accepting it in the specific way of something that had been without something necessary for a long time. At the 7th point, she held the contact longer than the others. Something happened that she had not expected. The territory responded back. Not through the soil temperature or the biological coherence frequency. Through something that the old texts had tried to describe and that she had read as metaphorical and now understood was a literal description of a literal process, the territory's own accumulated awareness of itself. Its 400 years of biological memory, pressing up through the soil and against her hand like a creature pressing against a door. She pulled her hand back. She stood very still. Kaelin said, "What just happened?" She said, "The territory is more aware than I expected. The destabilization has not damaged the memory layers. It has only disordered the surface function." He said, "The memory layers." She said, "The accumulated biological record of everything that has lived and died in this territory for 400 years. The fungal networks carry it. The destabilization is disordering the current function, but the deep record is intact." She said, "Which means the territory knows what it used to be and wants to return to it. The bonding is not me teaching the territory. It is me giving the territory the specific resource it has been missing that would allow it to do what it already knows how to do." He said, "You." She said, "The Frostcaller presence. Specifically mine." She said it with the specific, careful honesty of someone who was being very precise about a distinction that mattered. He noticed the precision. He said, "Veyra." She said, "Yes." He said, "The terms you proposed when you arrived at the boundary." She said, 6 months of archive access and collaboration on the Eastern Quarter situation." He said, "I want to propose a revision." She said, "Propose it." He said, "The 6 months is insufficient for the bonding process. The old texts suggest full bond development requires between 4 and 8 months of sustained presence. I want to revise the timeline to whatever the bonding process requires." She said, "That changes the nature of the arrangement." He said, "Yes." She said, "In what way?" He said, "In the way that a temporary collaboration and a permanent presence are different arrangements." She looked at him. He said, "I am not proposing to manage you or classify you or control what you do with what you are. I am proposing that the Greyveil territory is where you are supposed to be and that the evidence for that proposition is what just happened at the 7th contact point." He said, "I am also aware that you came north looking for a collaboration and not a permanent arrangement, and that deciding to revise the terms unilaterally would be exactly the kind of thing that you left the Ironhold Pack over." He said, "So I am proposing it and asking for your assessment." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "The territory responded to me specifically." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not to the Frostcaller capability in the abstract. To me." He said, "That is what the old texts describe. The bonding is not bloodline to territory. It is individual to territory. The specific wolf and the specific land." She said, "Which means another Frostcaller would not produce this result." He said, "The texts say no. The bond is singular." She put her hand back on the ground at the 7th contact point. The territory pressed back immediately. patient and enormous and absolutely certain. She said, "My assessment is that the revision is warranted." She said, "I want to revise my terms in parallel." The Eastern Quarter family's situation gets resolved. The Frostcaller bloodline gets formally documented in the Regional Governance Network in a classification that acknowledges rather than suppresses. And I am here on my own terms as a partner to this territory and this governance structure, not as a ward or an asset or a strategic acquisition. He said, "Those terms are acceptable." She said, "Then we have a revised arrangement." She said, "Now tell me what you know about the Greyveil Pack to the east, because their territorial maps overlap with Sector 14, and I think the destabilization in that sector has an external cause." He said, "I have been thinking the same thing for 2 years." She said, "Show me the reports." They walked back to the watch station and spent the evening with the maps and the reports and the specific quality of 2 people working on a problem with genuine complementary knowledge, who have each been working on it alone for too long. This story has barely started. Stay with it. Subscribe and leave a comment and tell us what you think of Veyra. Has any wolf heroine ever terrified you and inspired you at the same time like this? Share this story with every person you know who deserves a romance where the abandoned one comes back as the thing that was always supposed to be feared. Like the video. Comment your most powerful moment. Share it everywhere. Every single action keeps this story alive. Do all 4 right now. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Chapter 4. The fight the territory needed. The Greyveil Pack moved on the 3rd month. Not with the diplomatic subtlety of a pack that had legitimate grievances and appropriate channels. With 300 wolves in combat configuration moving through the eastern Greyveil boundary zone in the specific formation of a pack that had made a military decision and was implementing it. Veyra felt them before any of the Greyveil lookout stations registered the movement. She felt them through the territory. Not through the Frostcaller's sensory capabilities, which operated on environmental frequency rather than intelligence. Through Sector 14 itself, which had been the focus of her bonding work for the past 6 weeks and had developed a level of connection to her awareness that was beginning to approach what the old texts called the early bond threshold. The territory felt the approach, and the territory's feeling moved through the nascent bond to her, and her wolf woke from the half-rest it maintained during human form hours and pressed forward with the specific quality of a warning. She was in the restricted archive when it happened. She was on her feet before the feeling had fully resolved into information. She found Kaelin in the command room. She said, "Greyveil. Eastern boundary. 300 wolves. Combat configuration." He moved immediately. She said, "Kaelin." He turned. She said, "They are moving through Sector 14 specifically. Not toward the central pack house. Through the sector." He said, "They are testing the destabilized sector." She said, "They know about the destabilization." He said, "I have suspected for 2 years that the destabilization in Sectors 7, 11, and 14 had an external origin. If Greyveil has been deliberately destabilizing the territory to create an exploitable weakness." She said, "Then the 3 months since I arrived have given them less time than they expected to complete the process. The territory has been recovering faster than the destabilization was progressing." He said, "Because of the bonding work." She said, "Yes." He said, "They are moving now because they know the window is closing." She said, "Yes." He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Time to reach Sector 14 before the formation does. And then stay out of the sector until I tell you it is finished." He said, "Veyra." She said, "I know what I am asking. I am asking you to trust 6 weeks of evidence instead of 12 years of standard tactical doctrine." He said, "I trust you." He said it the way he said everything, directly and without performance. She said, "Keep the Greyveil line at the sector boundary. Do not enter. The bonding is not complete and the territory force is not at full expression yet. But it is enough." She said, "It has to be enough." She left the command room and she ran. Sector 14 was 7 kilometers from the command center, running east along the boundary ridge and then down into the low valley terrain where the sector's specific erosion had been most severe. She covered the 7 kilometers in the time that it took the Greyveil formation to cover the last kilometer of their approach, which was fast, but not fast enough. She felt the formation enter the sector boundary. She was at the sector center when they crossed it. The sector center was a low point in the valley where 4 seasonal streams converged before flowing south, a naturally significant point in the sector's hydrology that had been the first place she had felt the territory's memory press back against her hand. She had been back to this point 17 times across 6 weeks of bonding work. The connection here was the strongest. She shifted. The Frostcaller wolf in the center of Sector 14 was not the same wolf that had stood in the Ashenmoor Flats on the first night of exile. 7 years of careful suppression and 3 nights of the Ashenmoor and 6 weeks of bonding work had changed the relationship between what she was and what she could access. She shifted completely and the territory responded completely, and the two things together produced the specific phenomenon that the old texts described as the bonded state and that she was experiencing for the first time at full depth. The temperature dropped. Not by 3 degrees. By 17 degrees in the initial radius, expanding outward from her position at the sector center across the valley floor in all directions at a speed that the Greyveil formation had no time to assess or respond to. The leading edge of the formation hit the territory force at the 400-meter radius. The territory force was not the Frostcaller's power alone. It was the specific combination of the Frostcaller's presence and the territory's own accumulated biological force channeled through the nascent bond. The ancient power of 400 years of land memory directed through the specific kind of wolf that the territory had been missing and had just received. The leading edge of the Greyveil formation stopped. Not the organized stop of a formation that has encountered an obstacle and is adjusting. The involuntary stop of wolves whose wolf nature has received a signal they do not have a category for, a signal that registers in the deepest instinctive layer of what a wolf is and says, "This territory is not yours, and what is holding it is above the level at which you are permitted to challenge." 47 wolves in the leading edge went to one knee. Not in submission. In the involuntary acknowledgement of hierarchy that occurred when a wolf encountered the Frostcaller territory force at its bonded expression, which the old texts described as the most ancient and most absolute hierarchy signal available to wolfkind, predating every pack structure and every alpha classification by at least 800 years. The Greyveil formation commander was a large experienced alpha named Torval who had been leading tactical engagements for 15 years and had never in those 15 years encountered anything that made his formation drop to one knee without a command to do so. He pushed forward. He came through the leading edge and drove his wolf into the territory force directly, and his wolf was capable and experienced and had everything that 15 years of developed alpha strength could produce. He hit the bonded territory force. The cold hit him like a wall that was made of something living. Not ice, not temperature as a weapon, but the specific cold of a territory that was fully occupied by its bonded Frostcaller and was using that occupancy to communicate that it was not available for taking. His wolf went still in the way that wolves go still when their instincts have overridden their training. He shifted back to human form. He stood in Sector 14 of the Greyveil territory in the 17-degree temperature drop with 47 of his wolves on one knee around him and 253 more stopped at the formation boundary, and he looked at the center of the valley, where the Frostcaller wolf stood with the territory frost spreading outward from her position in visible patterns on the winter ground. He said, "What is this?" The wolf looked at him. She did not shift back. Not yet. She let him look. She let him look at the pale blue-white wolf with the territory force visible in the air around her as a shimmer of cold that the winter light moved through in the specific way that light moves through ice that has been formed under pressure. She let him understand. Then she shifted back and stood in the sector center in her dark traveling clothes, and her pale, almost colorless eyes looked at Toral and she said, The Greyveil Pack's Sectors 7, 11, and 14 have been deliberately destabilized by your pack's underground infrastructure operations over the past 4 years. I have documented evidence of the operation, and the documentation has been filed with the Regional Governance Network. She said, the destabilization has been reversed. The territory is bonded. This sector and the 2 adjacent are no longer exploitable through the mechanism your operations created. She said, you have 2 options. You can withdraw and direct the Greyveil Alpha to the Regional Governance Network's formal inquiry process, where the documented evidence will be reviewed. Or you can continue forward and find out what a bonded Frostcaller territory force looks like at full engagement rather than the fraction you just experienced. She said, I recommend the first option. Torval looked at her. He said, what are you? She said, someone who was exiled into the Ashenmoor 3 months ago and has had a very productive 3 months. She said, your choice. He looked at the territory frost still spreading across the sector valley floor. He looked at the 47 wolves still slowly rising from one knee around him. He looked at the 253 wolves stopped at the formation boundary. He said, withdraw. The formation withdrew. She stood in the sector center until the last of them crossed back through the eastern boundary. Then she pressed both hands flat against the Sector 14 ground and let the territory force settle back into the land, the accumulated energy of the bonded expression releasing from the air and returning to the soil where it was already doing its slow, patient work of coherence restoration. She was still kneeling when Kalen arrived. He had broken the instruction to stay at the sector boundary approximately 14 seconds after the temperature drop began, because he was the alpha of this territory, and watching his territory do something he had read about in ancient texts from 300 meters away was not something he was capable of sustaining. He came through the valley to where she was kneeling, and he crouched beside her, and he said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am very cold." He said, "You are very cold." She said, "That was more territory force than I have channeled in one engagement. The territory gives it freely, but the channeling takes something." He said, "What does it take?" She said, "I will need several hours of rest and warmth," which I did not expect to need. The texts did not mention this. He said, "The texts were written by observers, not carriers." She said, "That is a fair point." He said, "Come back to the pack house. We will find you warmth." She said, "The 47 wolves who went to one knee." He said, "I saw." She said, "It will spread through the Greyveil formation by morning. The Regional Governance Network will know by the end of the week." He said, "Yes." She said, "The Ironhold Pack will hear about it too." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that a problem for you?" He said, "The Ironhold Pack exiled a Frostcaller into the Ashenmoor in winter for speaking accurately about their governance failures. If they're hearing about the consequences of that decision is a problem, I am willing to have that problem." She looked at him. He had snow on his coat from running through the sector, and his dark green eyes were doing the thing they did when he was integrating something significant and had not yet finished. She said, "You broke the instruction." He said, "I am aware." She said, "You were supposed to stay at the sector boundary." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you not?" He said, "Because watching you kneel in the frost alone after channeling something that large was not acceptable to me." She said, "I was not in danger." He said, "I know. That was not the reason." She held that. She said, "Help me up." He gave her his hand and pulled her to her feet, and the contact was warm in the specific way of something that had been building for 3 months of close work and honest conversation and genuine respect, and was now simply present in the winter air of a sector that had just remembered what it was supposed to be. They walked back to the pack house. The Sector 14 ground was warmer behind them than it had been in 4 years. Chapter 5. What the Cold Built. The Regional Governance Network's formal inquiry into the Greyveil operations took 11 weeks. Veyra spent 7 of those 11 weeks in the restricted archive and 4 of them in field work with the sector recovery operations, and all 11 of them in the specific productive engagement with a problem that she had spent 23 years looking for, without knowing that was what she was looking for. The Ironhold Pack's formal inquiry came in week 6. It was a request for information from the regional governance network addressed to the Greyveil Pack, requesting the formal record of the individual identified as a former Ironhold Pack member currently resident in Greyveil territory. The language of the request was the careful language of an institution that had understood that it had made a consequential error and was attempting to document the situation before the error's consequences finished assembling themselves. Kaelin brought the request to her. She read it. She said, "They want to know what I am." He said, "Yes." She said, "They have heard about the Sector 14 engagement and they are trying to understand what they exiled." He said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to tell them?" He said, "I am going to tell them what I know, which is formally documented in the Greyveil Bloodline Registry and the Regional Governance Network's archive. I am going to tell them that the individual they exiled to the Ashenmoor in winter is a documented Frostcaller, and that the Frostcaller bloodline is now formally registered in the Northern Range Governance Framework as a protected bloodline classification, under the revision that the Regional Governance Network ratified in Week 4. She said, "And the Eastern Quarter families." He said, "The formal resolution of the Eastern Quarter situation is in Week 9's Governance Network session agenda. The Ironhold Council has not formally accepted the oversight finding, but they have stopped contesting it, which in governance terms is the same as acceptance." She said, "It is not the same." He said, "No. But it produces the same practical outcome for the families." She said, "I want the formal acceptance before Week 11. He said, "I will make that a condition of the Ironhold inquiry response." She looked at him. He was in the restricted archive with her, which was where he spent most of his evenings now. Not because the archive required both of them, but because the conversations that happened in the archive in the evenings were the conversations that both of them had been having separately in their own minds for years before they had each other to have them with. She said, "Kaelin." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you something about the bonding." He waited. She said, "The old texts describe the Frostcaller bond as being with the territory. A wolf bonding to land. And that is accurate as far as it goes. But what the old texts do not describe, because the observers who wrote them were observing from the outside of the process, is what the territory bond feels like from the inside." She said, "From the inside, the territory bond is not separate from everything else. It is not compartmentalized. When you bond to a territory, you bond to everything in the territory. The land and the water and the biological systems and the ecosystem. And the wolves." She said, "The wolves who are part of the territory." He said, "Part of the bond." She said, "Not automatically. Not passively. Only the wolves who are genuinely part of the territory, who have their roots in it the way the old fungal networks have their roots in it." He said, "And?" She said, "You are part of this territory in a way that I have not felt from any other wolf here. Your 9 years have done something to the territory that is not just governance. It is the specific thing that happens when someone genuinely belongs somewhere rather than simply occupying it." She said, "And when I bonded to the territory, I felt that. I felt you in it, the way I feel the old fungal networks and the memory layers." She said, "I want to be very precise about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying the bond created something between us. I am saying the bond showed me something that was already there." He was very still. He said, "The bond showed you." She said, "Yes." He said, "And from the inside. What did it show you about yourself?" She said, "That I am where I am supposed to be. That the 3 months have felt the way things feel when you are finally in the right place after a very long time of being in the wrong one. That the territory bonded to me specifically and not to the Frostcaller capability in the abstract because something in this land recognized something in me that matches it." She said, "And I would like to understand what that is. Whether it is the bloodline alignment that the old texts describe. Whether it is something more personal. Whether it is both." He said, "I've been thinking about the same question." She said, "What have you concluded?" He said, "That the old texts describe the Frostcaller and the territory's alpha as the specific pairing that produces a fully bonded territory. Not separately. Together. The Frostcaller bonds to the land and the alpha bonds to the Frostcaller and the land holds both." He said, and that the text described this as the most stable territorial configuration in the old governance framework. More stable than any single wolf governance structure. He said, and that I read that passage for the first time 5 years ago and put it in a separate file titled Things I Am Keeping because they are important, and I did not know why. She said, and now you know why. He said, I suspect yes. I am not certain yet. I would like more information before I am certain. She said, what information? He said, I want to understand what you want. Not what the bloodline requires, and not what the territory needs, and not what the governance framework would benefit from. What Veyra Ashk, who was abandoned in the Ashenmoor 3 months ago and walked north with a proposal and a 23-page archive of self-knowledge, wants. She said, that is the most important question you have asked me. He said, I know. She said, I want to stay. She said, I want to do this work. The territory recovery and the governance documentation and the archive research. I want to do it from here because this is where the work is and where the territory is and where you are. She said, and I want to do it as myself. Not as a classified bloodline or a strategic asset or an arranged pairing in a governance framework. As Veyra Ashk, who chose to come north and chose to stay, and is choosing all of it on her own terms. He said, those are the same terms you arrived with. She said, yes. They have not changed. He said, mine have not changed either. He said, I want to tell you something about the territory that the old texts do not describe. She said, tell me. He said, the territory has been showing signs of what the erosion reports describe as anomalous recovery acceleration in all 3 affected sectors since you arrived. Faster than the bonding process alone should be producing at this stage. Faster than anything the texts describe as expected. He said, the pack healer who monitors the sector health indicators brought me the latest readings this morning. The recovery rate in Sector 14 is 3 times what the projected bonding timeline would suggest for week 12. She said, 3 times. He said, yes. She said, the bond must be stronger than I realized. He said, or it is not only the bond to the territory that is driving the recovery. He said, the text described the Alpha Frostcaller pairing as producing an amplification effect on the territorial bond. Both the bond and the recovery. She said, which would explain the accelerated rate. He said, yes. He said, the pairing that produces the amplification effect is not the governance pairing. The texts are specific about this. It is the personal one. She looked at him. He said, the territory has been ahead of us. She said, the territory has been ahead of us. She said, I want more information too, Kaylin. I want the full 11 weeks and whatever comes after. I am not interested in a conclusion that has been reached quickly. He said, neither am I. He said, I am also not interested in pretending that I do not know what the territory readings are telling me. She said, what are they telling you? He said, that whatever this is between us, the territory registered it before we had words for it. And the territory is 300 times more accurate than my own perception. She said, 300 times. He said, approximately. Give or take the precision margin on the sector health indicators. Something happened to her expression that she was not managing. Not a smile exactly. The expression of someone who has spent 3 months being entirely precise about everything and has just encountered a moment where the precision and the thing the precision was pointing at arrived at the same point simultaneously. She said, the Ironhold Pack exiled me to the Ashenmoor, so I could not speak truth in their council chamber. She said, I found the Greyveil territory. She said, I found you. She said, and the territory figured out what you were to me before I did. He said, the territory is very old. It has had a long time to develop pattern recognition. She said, Kaylin. He said, yes. She said, I am staying. He said, I know. He said, the territory has known for 8 weeks. The formal Frostcaller bloodline registry entry was completed in week 10 and entered into the Northern Range Governance Network's permanent record on the first day of week 11. The entry was the first formal documentation of the Frostcaller bloodline in the governance framework's 300-year history. It was drafted by Veyra Ashk and reviewed by Kaelin Dusk and authenticated by the Regional Governance Council. The Ironhold Pack's formal acceptance of the Eastern Quarter oversight finding came on the last day of Week 11, which was the condition Kaelin had set for the Ironhold inquiry response. The Sector 14 recovery reached full coherence restoration in Week 14, for months ahead of the most optimistic projection in the old texts. The Sector recovery team documented it carefully. The documentation included a note from the senior field observer that read, "Recovery acceleration inconsistent with standard bonding timeline. Territory showing integration pattern consistent with dual bond amplification described in pre-governance texts. Recommend extended monitoring." In the Ashenmoor Flats, which had registered a seismic event at the 400-meter radius on the first night of Veyra Ashk's exile, the pale mineral soil showed the first growth of a plant species that had not been documented in the Ashenmoor for 60 years. The plant was a cold-adapted root species. It grew best in temperatures that other plants could not survive. The Ironhold Council, reviewing the Regional Governance Network's formal documentation of what they had exiled, did not make a public statement. Some things did not require one. That is the story of Veyra Ashk. The Omega abandoned in the Ashenmoor in winter, who spent 3 nights there discovering that the killing cold was not her enemy but her inheritance. Who walked north with nothing but 7 years of hidden knowledge and a proposal for a collaboration, and found a territory that recognized her before she recognized herself. Who restored 3 destabilized sectors, stopped an invasion in a single engagement, documented a bloodline that had been suppressed for 300 years, and discovered that the Alpha who read primary sources and named his notes things I am keeping because they are important had been part of a pattern that the territory understood 8 weeks before either of them had the words for it. If this story moved you, then do all 4 things right now. Subscribe. Leave a comment telling us your most powerful moment. Share this with everyone who deserves a wolf heroine whose power came from the cold they sent her to die in. Like the video so more people find Veyra. Subscribe, like, comment, and share.